Thank you. I'm Max Ventilla, the founder and CEO of AltSchool. And before I start, I want to ask the audience a question. So, if you had to choose between reading nonfiction, fiction, or science fiction for the rest of your life, what would you choose? You have to choose one. So, raise your hand if you would choose nonfiction. Okay. Raise your hand if you would choose fiction. Okay, about twice as many people. Raise your hand if you would choose science fiction. About half as many people. So, I think that the people who chose nonfiction are very interested in the past. I think the people who chose fiction are very interested in the present. I think the people that chose science fiction are very interested in the future. Not only the past, present, or future, but mostly. And I think education needs all three. We need to understand what's happened in the past. We need to engage students in the present. And we need to look forward not just to what's coming, but what we want to happen in the future. And so I start with the past. And I believe Confucius said it perfectly. If you want to define the future, study the past. So what happened in the past? What is in our past? I think this is the most interesting depiction of what has come in the last 10,000 years. And something rather striking is in this chart, which shows how many people live on Earth. But you see almost the exact same chart for life expectancy, for wealth per person. So what happened here? About mid-1800, that all of a sudden allowed humans to take off, to go from horizontal to vertical. Most of us studied. It was the Industrial Revolution that happened. It was the fact that we learned how to get free physical work from the ground. And this completely changed society, it completely changed the world. So we're unquestionably in a similar revolution. But this time it's not about free physical work, it's about free mental work. And when I think about the future for my children, I think about the fact that today it costs hundreds of dollars to get the power of the human brain from a computer. In 20 years, if this curve that has been going for 100 years continues, it will cost less than a penny to get the power of a human brain from a computer per hour. That's what my children will have as their opportunity when they get a job as an adult, or what the threat will be to them to get a job when they are an adult. And so I look at education systems in the US, in Europe, in Asia, that are, I believe, largely using technology to teach children to think like computers at precisely the moment in history when that kind of thought is going to go from being fairly expensive to being basically free. And while I believe that there are useful ways to have children learning from a screen, that if the majority of the experience is a computer teaching our children, if the way that we evaluate what children know is with tests that computers can already take better than most people taking the test, then we are not preparing them for the future that's coming. In America, we see an education approach, like the one that I showed, that is reaching its limits. You see high school graduates went from almost none of the population to about 70% over 70 years with this kind of industrial model of education. It was great for that time. And then all of a sudden you see in 1970, it stopped getting better. People stayed at about 70% graduation, despite more money, more effort. Another measure is how engaged are children over time. In the present of their education, how involved are they? How interested are they? And what you see is children start out fairly engaged, but over time, the average student in the average school is less and less engaged. They go from most 76% engaged to less than half, 44% engaged by the time they get to high school. Fortunately, there's broad consensus from research, from education experts, that 21st century education, the ideal education, centers on the student. It looks at their academic growth, but also their social emotional growth, who they are as people. It is personalized to each child. That means they're learning together, they're in a classroom, but the learning matches what each student needs. And the student actually drives their learning. They are able to be engaged in what happens to them. Whether you are a 5-year-old or a 50-year-old, humans don't like being told exactly what to do, exactly when, exactly how. You want choice. So how do we do that? How do we do that at scale? We all believe that technology is a huge opportunity, but where can that technology play a role? So schools spend about 90% of their budgets on the critical teachers, on the critical spaces in which children gather. But about 10% of spending can be pooled. You can take dollars from different schools, from different networks, and pool those dollars together to create something useful for everybody. This is the kind of benefit technology can bring. And while you've seen with connectivity and with devices a massive improvement, where today relatively small numbers of players provide very high quality products that are getting cheaper and cheaper, you have not seen that with software and training. And so that's where we believe the biggest opportunity is to create technology that bridges from the devices to the content, and that is the enabler for teachers to become better, to serve students better in the way that there's broad consensus for what education should be. As a company that builds technology, AltSchool is creating a kind of platform at the software and training layer very differently than education technology has historically been built. And here I would make the comparison between a product like Snapchat that scales very big with very limited value and functionality originally, where eventually the value gets built out through R&D, versus something in biotechnology or in aeronautics, where you do real research and development for many years before you start to scale. And almost all educational technology has been built along that gray curve. And yet, it doesn't get over to where we need on the right side, where it's truly valuable, truly high quality. AltSchool has done the opposite, and we've raised about $200 million prior to scale, which is extraordinary for a startup to be able to spend on the real research and development required to build this kind of platform that starts at small scale with many gaps, but over time becomes more and more valuable. And to do that, we believe you need to be not just technology, but education and technology. That education and technology is not the same as EdTech. And what that means for us is, if you look at our leadership team, we have as many career educators, folks like Devin Vodicka, who ran a 25,000 student school district and is a career teacher, as well as engineers. Same number, same ratio. Folks like Bart Medarata, my co-founder, who ran Google.com for 10 years. And you bring these people together, first to create schools. We run real schools on both coasts of the United States, where every day children come from age 3 to 14, and they receive, like my daughter, the kind of education that we want for our children. But it's not just a great school. We have educators and engineers who work together to figure out, how do we take that ideal education and make it scale? How do we make it accessible for increasingly average teachers, increasingly average classrooms and students, and allow this kind of student-centered model where at different stations children can learn, grouped in a sensible way with their classmates in the real world. This is not digital learning. And where a teacher can play the critical role to support children and keep children on track. This is not about disrupting school. It's not about a radically different way that children learn. It is about using our existing schools and school systems and teachers to be radically better for their students. To do this, we started with a learning cycle that has nothing to do with technology, that has been around for 100+ years. This is from John Dewey, the famous education reformer in the US, from almost 100 years ago, who said the ideal education is not practice for life, it is life itself. And students are able to experience, they are able to, with their teachers, ask what happened. They're able to say, so what does that mean about me as a learner? And they're able to figure out, what does that imply for what comes next? And what AltSchool is a platform to enable every phase of that cycle. So we can engage students in their own learning. We can evaluate the progress that they make. We can understand that student over time and what would serve them best, and we can inform the plan for what comes next in their experience, with collaboration between students, between teachers, between student and teacher, and family and school at every step. And if you think about what this requires for a teacher without technology, it is almost impossible to do all of this unless you are a truly exceptional teacher or you are working with a very constrained curriculum and content, not with the huge expanse of curriculum and content that schools want to use. And so that is the other key aspect of the ideal platform and what we aim to build, which is we want to take connectivity and devices and EdTech products that already exist. We want to build one platform that a school or a school system can choose rather than 30 different tools they have to integrate. But then we want them to use radically different standards and curriculum and content, and we want them to be able to function in very different ways when you look at the classroom itself. And so by having consolidation at the bottom, you can actually allow more diversity, more freedom at the top. You can allow the schools and the governments that know those students best, that have the clearest sense of what should come, to make those decisions, but all use a common platform to pool their resources. And so let me give the specifics of the kind of two halves of the platform. We have a product called Playlist, and what Playlist allows is for two students in a physical classroom to do some activities together, like learning about Chicago or reading Huck Finn, but also to do activities separate with other children in different groups. And this allows a teacher to spend time planning and then spend time evaluating outside of those critical moments with the student, and make those moments with the student as effective as possible. This is one of the great things technology does. It lets you shift work in time, and it also lets you collapse space. You can have students who are working together, separated by distances. You can have an adult supporting a student even if they're not physically there in the classroom. By using Playlist, you are able to digitally represent the important things that are happening in the real world of the classroom. And you start to build an understanding over time of what has the student done? What will they be able to do? What would serve them best? You can start to pool knowledge based off of what the system sees is working for certain kinds of students in one place versus the other. And so here we use machine learning to take very different kind of signals of student progress. It could be feedback from a teacher, it could be a standardized test, it could be e-learning material. And over time, the system gets smarter and smarter, trained by teachers, to understand what does that imply for how the student is progressing. And like with Playlist, it doesn't matter what standards you use, it doesn't matter what curriculum you use or content you use. We have international baccalaureate schools, we have Montessori schools that buy our platform, and they use the same tools in the same way, but with very different experiences, very different curriculum, very different content. And we think that that is essential if you want to be a single platform for many, many schools, that you support many, many different types of learning and education systems. So today, what we see is an education experience that engages students far more, that attracts the best teachers, that makes parents much happier than they were in traditional schools, and that is allowing students to progress more in the precious time that they spend in school than approaches without this kind of platform. And so in the US, the best benchmark exam, we believe, is something called MAP. It asks how much progress has a student made over the course of the school year or year over year in essential subjects like reading and English and math. And what you see is in classrooms that are using the platform, students are making 20% more progress during the school year and 50% more progress year over year relative to wherever they started. And the students who start out the farthest behind are making the most gains, almost 2 times the average rate for students who are in the bottom quintile. Over time, we believe that this kind of platform, as the system can understand what's happening and what works, can go not just from enabling educators, especially higher quality educators, to increasingly informing and ultimately assisting average teachers and allowing them to get better faster. We think the role of the teacher is essential. We think that great teachers are made, not born. But we think that they are only made if they have the benefit of what is working collectively and they have help to do these things that are incredibly hard. Delivering a student-centered education is much harder than delivering school-centered or teacher-centered education. So we have to provide help. We don't think there's a bigger mission than this to enable all children to achieve their potential. We think that that is possible in the future. That in the future, the average education will be better than the best education today. And we think the stakes have never been higher to make sure that the world goes the right way, that we solve poverty, that we solve disease, rather than destroy ourselves. And we think that this is a moment in time where the difference between the best outcomes and the worst outcomes are the biggest they've ever been, and the opportunity to allow every child to get an education that we would want for our own children is actually there. And it's there with this kind of approach, and we're very fortunate to be able to work on a problem that is so big and that will take so long, but that we believe can actually, with all of the other people working in this space, yield the outcomes we all want. Thank you.
Very simple question from your presentation. And do you mean the AltSchool is changing your service model or business model from the supplying innovative teaching service to supplying innovative platform to support more innovative teaching and learning? Is right or not?
So we announced about 2 years ago that we would start to provide the platform that we built for our own schools to other schools. And starting this past September, we had the first group of schools, private and public schools, using the platform. And that's the way that we can scale our impact. But at the core is always the schools that we run. But what we actually scale is a network of schools using our common platform.
You mean it's not only change, it means extend your service. You use your platform to supply more service to other schools. besides your own schools, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
So
Thank you
our
very much.
schools are
Yeah.
a means to an end.
Yeah.
And not just here,
Yeah.
not just in the U.S., but we hope also abroad, in
Yeah.
places like China.
Yeah. Thank you very much. 谢谢。我刚才的问题是因为 AltSchool 它本身自己有一个非常创新的学校，我想问它的业务是不是转型？但是他特别清楚的是，因为他们在原来自己的学校里面做的这个平台，他们希望这个平台具有支持各类创新的内容、创新的这种教学方式的支撑，希望在原来的业务基础上，把他们这个平台共享给更多的地区、国家和学校。谢谢 Max 精彩的报告。